I've got a section here about racehorses, and when I started farming, I never dreamed that I'd be in the racehorse business. But that happened. During my early days on the farm, I had a lot of experience with working horses, cultivating and planting corn, mowing and raking hay, shucking corn, and during thrashing and silo filling time. I shucked corn by hand for 2 years after World War II, and when we bought a corn picker, I thought my horse driving days were over. But I was mistaken. As the kids got older, they wanted a pony. Jane especially was crazy about horses. When she was just a little tyke, she rode a stick horse everywhere she went. Grandpa Durr and Uncle Don Durr had standard-bred racehorses, and Jane and Craig decided we should get a broodmare and raise colts. Raise those colts to race, so Uncle Don bought a mare at a sale in Kentucky. And Craig and Jane bought that mare from him, and Craig and Jane and old Dad were now in partnership in the horse business. We dissolved the partnership when they went away to college, and they made a nice profit on the deal. I paid them everything they had invested in them, and they were using their money at that time to go to college, so I told them I'd buy their share for everything they had invested up to that point, and they made that deal with me. Over the years, I raised 28 colts and only lost one at foaling time. That meant that I spent a lot of time at the barn during foaling time. The mare we started with was a good one, so we had our share of good racehorses. Choochie was our first good one. The first year she raced, she won all of her county fair races. That was 12 heats in a row before racing at the state fair, where she placed 5th. The first colt that we raised was Chocolate Chipper, and it had a real good pedigree, but it didn't turn out to be a good racehorse, and she won one race, I think, and then that was all she won, so she wasn't very good. The second one was a full sister to Choochie, and was a good pedigree, and was a good racehorse, but she was hard to handle, so we didn't get her started racing very early in the year, so she didn't do much the first year. But Choochie came along, and she was just a little dream. She did everything right. Then there was Howitzer. Well, I got to tell you about going up to Jerseyville for Choochie's first race. She was had been in a matinee race and won both heats of her matinee race, so I thought she'd do pretty good. So Dell and I went up there to watch the races at Jerseyville, the first race of the county fair racing season, and Choochie won both heats, and I wasn't too surprised. And we'd been in the business for about 3 years then, and we'd been putting out quite a bit of money for training horses. We hadn't got anything back yet. These matinee races didn't pay anything purses. So that day we got our first check for winning a race. So we went back the next day, and this Eat My Dust horse was a 3-year-old. And I'd had her up to Moline to racing, and she had learned how to race, and then I brought her back to Carrollton for my trainer to train for the county fairs. So we went back the second day to watch her race, and she won both heats. And I can still remember going home, and Della said, "I can't believe this. I can't believe this. I didn't dream we'd win again today." And so that's the way it went. Choochie won her first 12 races, and this Eat My Dust won her first several races in the county fair, so we were living it up. Then there was Howitzer, who won a race at the state fair, and for 15 minutes he was the fastest 2-year-old gelding in the United States that year. In the next race, another horse lowered that record. That year he was second in the Governor's Cup race at DuQuoin, and this was the big race of the year for 2-year-old pacers. So we had a good horse that year. That was the best one we ever had. And the next year, I sent him up to Chicago to race, and he got infected with bloodworms. And so I had him entered in the Pete Langley race up there, which was to be raced, I think, in July. That was the big race in Chicago at that time, and I had hopes that we might be able to win that. But he got these bloodworms, and the veterinary finally said, well, we got to give him a double dose of wormer. And he said, you'll think he's going to founder, but he won't. So they gave him the double dose of wormer and got rid of the worms. And but that was getting pretty close to the Langley race. And so the trainer called me and he said, I don't know whether we ought to put him in there or not. And I said, well, I'm going to leave that up to you. You know more about it than I do. So he decided to enter him, and he raced, and I don't remember, they had elimination races. And the top horses in the elimination races got into the final. We didn't get into the final, but we were in one of the consolation races, and he got enough money. He didn't win it, but he got enough money to get our entry fee back. And so we didn't race him a lot that year because of that bloodburn situation. So I got to finish the story about Howitzer. He went on to race in Chicago, and was doing very well, and we eventually got to where we had to put him in claiming races. When you put a horse in a claiming race, that means that somebody puts up the claiming price. It's their horse after the race. For instance, if you got him in a $10,000 claiming race, and somebody has to pay $10,000 for him, and they put that claim in before the race. And if then after the race, he's their horse. But the person that owned him when the race went off gets the purse if he wins anything. So he got up to where we kept moving him up in claiming races. And another thing about the claiming races, if a horse is a 3-year-old, he has an allowance. So if you put him in a we put him in a $20,000 claiming race, and he had a 25% allowance. So that meant that the claiming price was $25,000. So the trainer called me and said, this is December, and that allowance goes off the 1st of January. He said, nobody's going to claim him in December because they can wait till after the 1st of January and get him $5,000 cheaper. I said, well, okay, go ahead and put him in. So he put him in, and guess what? He got claimed. But I got $25,000 for him. And my deal with the kids was that when I bought them out their share was that if I ever sold a horse real good, well, I'd divide up with him. So I gave each one of them a check for $8,000. So that was a profit on their deal.
Got the other 1,000.
And that was mine for
okay.
Yeah. that was for handling and so anyway, that was our best horse. And but I got to tell you a little bit more about that too. That was the year that Bessie and I got married after I lost my first wife, and we got married the 30th of December in 1978, and this was in December of 1978 that that horse got claimed. So the purse that I got for winning that race, he won the race incidentally, so I got that purse. And so that paid for our wedding trip to Israel. We took a wedding trip to Israel, and I got enough out of that purse to pay for that trip. So that's our story of Howitzer. And Howitzer, we kind of kept track of him after that, and the people that got him apparently didn't do too good a job. He never did as well for them as he did for us. And that happens a lot of times. Okay, let's see, where did I leave off here now? Then Howitzer, he won that race at the State Fair, and almost, we hoped to win at Chicago, and he did win some races at Chicago. And we got a good price for him. The next horse that was, I want to talk about is...
Fred, the paper's up a little too high, so you want to start it over.
Yeah. The next horse I want to talk about was named My Solus. And the kids came up with these names. I don't know where they got them. In later years, we named them all after our farm, which was the Q-View farm. And we named them, we had Q-View, Craig, and, well, it was Q-View Bozo. That was Craig's nickname, Bozo. Q-View Bozo. And we had Q-View Mindy and Q-View Danny and Q-View Randy. And so we named them after the kids, but it all started with Q-View. So if anybody saw a Q-View horse racing, they knew where it came from. My Solus was a full sister to Howitzer, and we expected her to race real well, but she foundered just before racing season began when she was a 2-year-old. She produced several nice colts for us, though, and I got this old man, Harry Bond, lived over here by Staunton, to come over and treat her. He treated foundered horses, but I didn't know anything about him until about 6 months after she foundered. And I really believe if I'd have got a hold of him when this first happened, that he would have brought her out of it. And I got her back to racing, but she still had a little bit of a limp, and she never really won any races after that, but she was a good prospect. In 1977, our old mare Kayak died right after giving birth to a filly, which Craig and James named That Darn Filly, because they had to get up in the middle of the night to feed that darn filly. Experienced horsemen told me that a bottle-fed colt would not make a good racehorse, because you couldn't keep from spoiling them. I found that they were right, as she would try to kick anyone but me. And if I'd have her in the cross ties in the barn and anybody walked by, she'd try to kick them. And she meant it. And so I had a fella, I broke her and trained her, got her started racing. Took her over to Altamont for the first race, and I had this fella, the driver, and he took her out to warm her up, and she misbehaved so bad that he come in and she said, I can't do anything with her. And I said, oh, now, he said, I've got this horse all ready to race. And he said, I want to race her. And he said, I said, I think if you get her out there with the other horses, she'll be all right. Okay, well, let's put a towel under her tail, and we'll tie her tail down, and we'll do this, and we'll do that, and I'll see what I can do. So he took her out there, and she got in with the other horses. She kind of forgot some of that stuff, and he came back, and he finished third, which wasn't too bad in the kind of race she was in. And so the next heat, I think she was third or fourth, and by then he was real proud of himself. And he was walking down the line talking, seeing some of these other drivers, and he says, hey, look what these hands will do. A driver's hands, they have to have good hands to drive a horse. Hey, look what these hands will do. So he was real proud of himself. But there's more to that story than this. I had her up to racing then, and so I found out the experienced horseman was right. She was kind of spoiled, and she'd try to kick anybody but me. And I had this driver to drive her up I think it was at Mount Sterling, and he took her out to warm her up, and she tried to kick him off the cart when he turned around and started around the track. And he was afraid to stay on there, and he got off the track, and he drove her back to the barn, walking behind the race bike. And as he went back to the judge's stand, Carl Becker was the announcer, and he says, Doug, what are you doing? And Doug says, well, you can believe it or not, but I'm warming up a horse. And so I saw what was happening, so he got back to the barn. I didn't have a driver's license then, but I could warm up a horse. I put my helmet on, and as soon as he got back to the barn, I got on the bike, and I drove her around there and turned her and warmed her up, and she went just fine. So, and when she got in with the other horses, well, she forgets some of that stuff. But I decided if I was going to train her, I'd drive her. So when I was 60 years old, this was when I was 60 years old, I got my driver's license to drive at county fairs. I passed my test and got my driver's license, and I could drive at county fairs, but not at the parimutuel tracks. My first drive was behind Q-View Randy. He was a pretty good racehorse, and that was at Altamont. The starting gate left, and we got away on top. That means we were ahead of the other horses. And we stayed there for 3/4 of the mile. When 2 horses passed us, we finished a respectable third. Craig was at home listening to the race on the radio. When I got home, he asked, Dad, why did you let those horses pass you at the 3/4 pole? Of course, my answer was that I didn't have enough horse to keep them from passing. But I finished up third, and that wasn't too bad for my first race. For the next 10 years, I drove several races at county fairs. My first win came at Greenville behind That Darn Filly, and it was the only race she ever won. My most satisfying win was at Carrollton behind Q-View Mindy. We were second the first heat to veteran driver Bob Walker and his good pacer. I thought I could beat him the next heat if I could get a good job driving. Generally, a good driver likes to race at least one horse in front, with one horse in front of him for most of the race, and then pull out and pass on the home stretch. It is easier for a horse to race behind another horse than out in front. I figured Richie Thompson, who was starting in the number 3 position in the second heat, would go out on top, and he did. Bob Walker was behind him, and I dropped in next to the rail in 3rd position behind Bob Walker. I figured Baumberger was the one I needed to beat. So we stayed in that position until we got into the backstretch the second time around. I figured then Bob and I could both beat Richie, but I wanted Bob to go too wide into that last turn so I could follow him. He didn't want me to pull out and box him in. So, and if I got alongside of him, that's what would happen. So he would look back every once in a while to see if I was beginning to pull out. And we played a little game of cat and mouse in the backstretch. He would look back to see if I was going to try to pass him, and I would pull QU Mindy away from the rail like I was. And the third time we did this, he decided I really was going to come. And he pulled out to pass Richie as he went into the last turn. I followed him around the north turn, and since my horse had the least tiring trip, I drove by him in the home stretch and won the race. Most races did not go according to plan, and drivers have to make their decisions as the race progresses. At age 71, I decided to hang up my colors, and I could look back on those 10 years of driving in races without having an accident. I did get a badly infected ankle in 1970 that put me in the hospital for 3 weeks, and was caused by type C streptococcus equi simili. That causes strangles in horses. And when I got to the hospital in Springfield, and this old doctor, he was from South America somewhere, and he said, we got to find out what's causing this. My leg swelled up and it got sore, and it got sore in a hurry. And I was in the hospital out here at Greenville for a while, and I was sitting in the hallway one day waiting to get an x-ray taken, and I had on a hospital gown, and my leg showed there, and it was just black and blue all up my leg, and it was swelled up big. And Dr. Daisy wasn't my doctor, but I knew him pretty well. He walked by and he looked at that leg and he said, "Boy, that looks bad." And I said, "Yeah, I know, Doc." And I said, "But you're not making me feel any better." Well, anyway, the medicine they were giving me wasn't doing the job, so I got up to the Memorial Hospital in Springfield, and this old doctor said, we got to find out what's causing this. And he took a needle and he punched into that swollen ankle, and he pulled some of that pus out of there. And I bet he was back there in 15 minutes, and he said, "I know what's causing it." And he said, it's type C streptococcus equi simili. And he said, "You've been working around horses?" "Yeah." He said, "Well, that causes strangles in horses." He said, "You know what several means?" And I said, "Well, to me it means at least 3. He said, "Yeah, it's going to take 3 weeks to get that out of there, 6 IVs a day." And that's what I took for 3 weeks, 6 IVs a day. And by the time that was up, I still had some fever, and I was afraid they were going to go back to the IVs, but he said, "No, just send him home and put him on antibiotics, but if his temperature gets up to 103, get him right back to the hospital." And it kept going down, and eventually I got over it. So that's what happened to me. And I asked him, I said, "Now I guess I'll have to stay away from the horses." He said, "No, I don't think you're any more likely to catch this than anybody else." But he first told me, when he first found this out, he said, "I think this is the first case we ever had." He told me later, he said, "No, this is the second. I found we had one other case." But they were so interested in it that they took pictures of the infection, and there was a racehorse farm out at Sherman, Illinois, just north of Springfield, and they took their classes, medical classes, out there to see horses that had strangles. And in horses, it doesn't act that way. They get a swelling under their throat, and it's a messy disease because it breaks and runs with horses. And so that's what happened to me in my racehorse career. So in 1990...
Hey, Fred, lower the paper again.
We
want to see your chin.
Yeah. So in 1990, at age 70, I retired from the racehorse business. We had moved into town in 1989. At 70 years of age, driving racehorses is not a safe occupation.